The Dover outpost did not smell of the future. It smelled of the past. It was a sprawling iron-ribbed structure anchored to the limestone cliffs of the Kentish coast, a relic of the Great Expansion era when humanity first reached for the stars from the soil of Old England. The air inside the docking bay was thick with the scent of salt spray, industrial ozone, and the faint, comforting aroma of oversteeped Earl Grey tea drifting from the break rooms. Outside, the English Channel churned with a restless slate-gray fury, the tides slamming against the magnetic pylons that held the orbital tether in place. Elias Thorne sat in the corner of the anchor and piston, a small pub tucked into the station's secondary maintenance tier. He was 34, with skin the color of weathered oak and eyes that had seen the crushing depths of the North Sea before they ever looked upon the vacuum of space. He was a man of dense architecture, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, and possessing a stillness that most alien species found deeply unsettling. On his forearms, a map of silver scars told stories of boiling water, jagged rusted hulls, and the casual violence of terrestrial life. The engineer watched from a safe distance as Elias strapped himself into a seat that groaned under his mass. "Thorne," Pip squeaked over the comms. "You realize that the Loss's hull is currently vibrating at a frequency that causes cellular dissociation in 90% of known life? The radiation in the nebula is equivalent to standing inside a microwave oven." "I've had worse sunburns in Brighton," Elias replied, checking the seals on his heavy-duty work boots. He wasn't being arrogant. He was recalling the time he'd spent 8 hours welding a pipe in a heat wave on the English coast. Human skin was a multi-layered fortress of regenerative cells, a persistent pattern that burned away and rebuilt itself with a tenacity that horrified the galaxy. The shuttle detached from Dover Station, the white cliffs of England shrinking into the distance as they dived toward the swirling violet and black clouds of the Goodwin Nebula. As they hit the outer veil, the shuttle began to scream. The gravitational shear hit them like a physical wall. Captain Clise collapsed into his crash couch, his hollow bones chiming with the resonance of Drunaki shock, a biological sound of terror. Elias, however, simply leaned forward, his internal organs shifting slightly to compensate for the 2.5 g load. His heart rate climbed to 75. His standing army of immune cells began to categorize the radiation leaking through the hull, his DNA already preparing the rapid-fire repair sequences that defined his species. To the aliens, the nebula was a monster. To Elias, it was just a bit of a stuffy room. "Look at him," Pip whispered into his recorder. "He isn't bracing. He is humming a tune." Elias was indeed humming a faint, low-frequency sea shanty. The vibration helped his fluids stay balanced against the external pressure. He watched the monitor as the SS Thalassa appeared, a silver needle being crushed by a giant invisible hand. The ship was dying. Its magnetic stabilizers were dark, and the hull was glowing a dull, angry red from the friction of the nebula's dense gas. "We can't dock," Clise moaned, his iridescent feathers turning a dull, sickly gray. "The docking clamps would snap. Someone has to go out there. In a suit. But the suit won't hold." "Then I'll go without the suit," Elias said, standing up. The 3G pressure made him feel like he was made of lead, but his 4x standard skeletal density didn't even creak. Section character count, 3,618 total character count, 7,160. The airlock of the shuttle hissed. Clise and Pip watched through the reinforced viewport, their various sensory organs flaring in disbelief. Elias Thorne stood in the chamber wearing nothing but his heavy work trousers, a thermal vest, and a tether. No pressure suit. No radiation shielding. Just a man in his biology. "Thorne, you will die," Clise cried out. "The vacuum." "It's not a vacuum, Captain. It's a high-pressure gas nebula," Elias corrected calmly. "The pressure out there is about 30 atmospheres. That's roughly 300 meters deep in the North Sea. I've done deeper without a hard suit. The trick is the breathing." He took a deep, lung-expanding breath of the shuttle's oxygen, his ribcage expanding like a bellows. He was loading his blood with O2, utilizing the massive storage capacity of human hemoglobin. He then signaled for the outer door to open. When the hatch slid back, the Goodwin Nebula didn't just enter. It attacked. The violet gas hissed in, roaring with the sound of 1,000 jet engines. The temperature was a searing 150 degrees Celsius, and the gravity tried to pin Elias to the floor like a bug. To the aliens, this was the end. To Elias, it was a Monday morning in the shipyard. He stepped out into the roaring violet void. His skin immediately turned a deep, angry purple as the capillaries burst under the sudden pressure, what Orvin had called moderate vascular bruising. His nociceptors, all 4 million of them, screamed in a chorus of agony that would have rendered any other species non-viable. But Elias Thorne's brain categorized the pain as data. He acknowledged it, suppressed it, and moved. He pulled himself along the tether toward the SS Thalassa. Each movement was a Herculean feat of muscular output. His bones, those dense zithral-defying structures, held firm against the 3G pull. He reached the manual override crank, a massive iron wheel that had frozen solid in the nebula's corrosive atmosphere. Inside the shuttle, Pip was vibrating so hard his suit was rattling. His heart rate is 140. His internal temperature is rising. He is literally cooking, and he is still turning the wheel. Elias gripped the wheel. The heat of the iron seared his palms, the smell of his own scorched flesh filling his nostrils. He didn't let go. He planted his feet against the hull, his thigh muscles bulging with enough force to crush a Dranaki's crystalline frame. With a roar that was lost in the screaming wind of the nebula, he heaved. The iron wheel groaned. It resisted. Then with a sound like a mountain cracking, it turned. Elias didn't stop. He turned it once, twice, 3 times. On the third rotation, the Thalassa's magnetic stabilizers flickered to life. A pulse of blue energy rippled across the hull, pushing back the nebula's crushing weight. The ship groaned as its internal gravity compensators engaged, stabilizing the environment for the dying crew inside. Elias Thorne let go of the wheel. He drifted for a moment, his vision blurring as the radiation began to interfere with his neural pathways. His skin was a ruin of burns and bruises, but beneath the surface, his persistent pattern was already fighting back. His cells were dying in the millions and being replaced in the millions. He pulled himself back along the tether, hand over hand, his movements slow and methodical. When he reached the airlock, he tumbled inside and hit the close button. The hatch hissed shut, and the automated scrubbers began to pump the violet poison out of the chamber. Section character count: 3,722 total character count. 10,882 when the inner door opened, the silence was absolute. Captain Klyes and Pip stood at the threshold, staring at the man on the floor. Elias was curled in a fetal position, his chest heaving, his skin a mottled map of trauma. He looked like a corpse that had been dragged through a fire and then stepped on by a giant. Klyes stepped back, his feathers trembling. He should be liquid. How is he still whole? Elias coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He spat a bit of blood onto the floor. Blood that was so dense with defensive cells it practically sizzled. Then he slowly uncurled. He grabbed the edge of a bulkhead and pulled himself up. His legs shook, but they held. "Tea," Elias wheezed, his voice a scorched rasp. "I think I've earned a cup of tea." They moved back to the station in a state of stunned reverie. The SS Thalassa followed on emergency power, its crew saved by a minute of human persistence. Back on Dover Station, the medical bay was waiting. But it wasn't the standard medical bay. It was a high-security isolation ward. Director Thessan, the Dranaki chief medical officer from the Aurelius Academy, had been summoned via high-priority comms. She stood in the center of the room, her crystalline bones emitting a constant, high-pitched chime of distress, as she looked at the holographic charts displaying Elias Thorne's vitals. "Medic Orvin warned me," Thessan whispered to herself, her angular frame radiating a mix of authority and profound unease. "He told me their maximum is our default. But this is not biology. This is a haunting." Elias sat on a scanning bed, much like Senna had. He was casually peeling the dead skin off his forearms, revealing fresh, pink, new tissue underneath. He had been back on the station for 2 hours. "Mr. Thorne," Thessan said, her voice utilizing the standard Dranaki intimidation posture. "Do you understand that you just absorbed enough ionizing radiation to kill a small colony? Do you understand that your skeletal structure now has microfractures that would leave any other creature paralyzed for life?" Elias looked up. He took a sip of the Earl Grey tea Pip had brought him. "I feel a bit stiff if I'm honest." Like I've done 10 rounds with a heavyweight. But I've had worse flu, Director. Thessan stepped back, her bones chiming louder. Your heart rate is 68. You are sitting here, drinking a beverage, while your body is performing a mass reconstruction of your entire cellular network. You are not a patient, Mr. Thorne. You are a biological hazard. I am officially flagging your species as a Class 12 Death World entity. You are restricted from all Class 1 through 3 sectors. Elias shrugged. That's fair. We're a bit much for the polite parts of the galaxy, aren't we? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, a repair manual from the shuttle. With steady, burnt fingers, he began to fold it. He worked with absolute precision, despite the microfractures in his hands. Thessan watched, paralyzed. She saw the way his fingers moved, a persistent pattern surviving while its material burned away. By the time he was finished, a small paper crane sat on the edge of the medical scanner. For the Voshari empath, Elias said, nodding toward a screen where UV was visible in another room, still recovering from the weight of his calm. Tell her it's a sign of peace. Section character count, 3,491 total character count, 14,373. The aftermath of the SS Thalassa incident rippled through the Dover outpost like a shockwave. Word of the man who walked the nebula spread through the docking bays and the grease-stained corridors of the maintenance tiers. To the humans of the station, Elias was a hero, a legend of the salvage trade. To every other species, he was a reminder of why Earth was left alone for so long. Director Thessan remained in her office for 3 days, staring at the data. She compared Elias's metrics to the Earth files. Class 12 Death World. Tectonic instability. Apex predator domestication. She looked at the videos of Earth, the massive crashing waves of the Atlantic, the searing heat of the Sahara, the bone-chilling cold of the Antarctic. Humans hadn't just survived these things, they had turned them into vacation spots. They play in the graveyards of the universe, she whispered into her recorder. In the anchor and piston, Elias Thorne sat in his usual corner. His skin had mostly healed, the deep purple bruises fading to a yellowish hue. He was looking at a new contract, a salvage job in the debris field of a collapsed star. It was dangerous high-gravity work. Paid well. Captain Klyes approached his table, walking with a newfound hesitant respect. He sat down, his iridescent feathers fluffing slightly in the pub's warmth. Thorne, Klyes began, his clicks and whistles more rhythmic now. The crew of the Thalassa. They wished to thank you. They have collected a sum of credits. And they wanted to know something. Elias looked up from his data slate. Yeah. Why? Why did you go out there? You knew it would hurt. You knew it could kill you. Elias took a long pull of his tea, the steam fogging his vision for a second. He thought about the North Sea, about the cold that gets into your bones and never leaves. He thought about London, about a city that had been burnt and bombed and shaken and still stood tall. Because someone had to do it, Captain, Elias said simply. And because back home we're taught that pain is just a signal. Doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're still alive. Klyes stared at him. He saw the scars on Elias's arms, the dense wall of calm in his eyes, and the sheer biological weight of the man. He realized then that humanity didn't possess an immune system. They were an immune system. They were the galaxy's way of ensuring that even in the most hostile corners of existence, something would persist. Elias finished his tea and stood up. He had work to do. As he walked toward the door, his heavy boots thudding against the iron floor, the paper crane he had left in the medbay sat perfectly still on Director Thessan's desk. It was fragile, made of mundane paper, yet it had been formed by hands that had defied a nebula. The Dover outpost continued its orbit, a tiny speck of light against the white cliffs of England. Below, the English Channel roared, the waves crashing against the shore with a relentless, persistent rhythm. It was a violent, beautiful, terrifying world. And it was exactly where Elias Thorne belonged. The director's final report was filed that night. It was short, a stark contrast to her usual academic verbosity. Patient. Elias Thorne, human. Assessment. Not a biological hazard in the traditional sense. However, the Academy must understand, our normal is not their normal. Our maximum is their default. If the galaxy is a house, humans are the ones who built the foundation in a storm. Do not mistake their gentleness for fragility. They are the only things that survive when the material burns away. The medbay doors slid shut. The holographic metrics faded to black. But in the darkness, the numbers remained, too terrifying to clear. Section character count: 3,928. Total character count: 18,301. The weeks following the Nebula walk saw a shift in the social fabric of Dover Outpost. The station had always been a crossroads, but now it felt like a frontier. More humans were arriving, drawn by the rumor of high-paying hazardous duty contracts that only their biology could fulfill. They walked through the corridors with a casual confidence that seemed to vibrate against the station's artificial atmosphere. Elias Thorne found himself as an unofficial ambassador of sorts. He didn't want the title, but when an Aurelian freighter had a leak in their ammonia tanks, or a Dranaki research vessel needed a manual repair near a solar flare, they didn't call the specialized robots anymore. They called the Thalassa survivor. Elias was currently in the station's lower dry dock, overseeing the refitting of a derelict tugboat he'd purchased with his salvage credits. He named it the Harrower, after a class of deep-sea trawlers from his youth. The ship was a brute, all thick hull plating and overpowered engines. It was built for the kind of deathworlder work Elias excelled at. Mr. Thorne. Elias looked up from a hydraulic manifold. It was Medtech UV, the Vasharian empath. She was hovering a few inches off the ground, her gray feathers shimmering with a nervous energy. Since her collapse in the medical bay during Senna's intake weeks ago, she had been fascinated and terrified by humans. I wanted to return this, UV said, her voice like wine through dry leaves. She held out the paper crane Elias had folded. Director Thessan said it was for me. Elias wiped his greasy hands on a rag and took the crane. It was slightly crumpled, but the persistent pattern of the avian shape remained. Kept it, did you? I couldn't throw it away, UV whispered. When I touch it, I don't feel the weight of your biology. I feel a different kind of calm. It's not the flat wall of relaxation that knocked me out before. It's focus. Elias smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. That's the secret, UV. We're not relaxed because we're safe. We're relaxed because we know we can handle the danger. It's the focus that keeps the fear at bay. UV tilted her head. Is that why you don't use the empath suppressors like the other species do when they work with us? Our emotions flare and it distracts them. But you just absorb it. Humans have been living with emotional flares for a long time, Elias said, leaning back against the Harrower's hull. We've got a history of poets and soldiers, monks and madmen. We're used to the noise inside our heads. Your empathic output is just another bit of weather to us. Suddenly, the station's main Vox system crackled. It wasn't the harmonic wail of an Aurelian this time. It was the frantic, panicked voice of a human operator from the Dover control tower. Emergency! All hands! We have a hull breach in the White Cliffs residential sector. A freighter lost its docking guidance and slammed into the limestone anchors. Tectonic resonance is triggering a cliffside collapse. Elias's eyes snapped to the viewport. Far below, the massive white cliffs of Dover, the literal foundation of the station's planetary anchor, were shuddering. A cloud of chalky dust was rising into the gray English sky. Section character count: 3,485. Total character count: 21,786. The residential sector White Cliffs was a masterpiece of Victorian futurism, a series of glass and steel terraces built directly into the chalk face. It housed thousands of station workers and their families, many of them non-human species who required the stable gravity of the planetary anchor. When the freighter slammed into the anchors, it sent a kinetic shockwave through the limestone that a human would describe as an earthquake, but to an Aurelian or a Vasharian, it was the end of the world. The limestone, though sturdy, was brittle. Huge slabs of white rock began to shear off, tumbling toward the churning channel below, taking parts of the residential terraces with them. The structural supports are snapped. Pip's voice screamed over the general comms. The entire Sector 4 is sliding. Gravity anchors are offline. Elias didn't wait for orders. He grabbed his heavy-duty magnetic winch and a pair of industrial thermal cutters. UV, stay here. Get the medbay ready. There's going to be a lot of fragile people needing help. He ran toward the atmospheric shuttle, his boots pounding the iron grates. He could feel the vibration in his bones, a deep low-frequency rumble that he recognized from the Great Expansion quakes. His heart rate didn't spike. It settled into a steady rhythmic 80 beats per minute. This was his Deathworlder instinct taking over. As he reached the collapse site, the scene was chaos. Dust blinded the sensors. The air was filled with the screams of aliens whose fragile bodies were being crushed by the simple weight of falling rock. An Aurelian mother was trapped under a steel beam, her iridescent feathers caked in white chalk, her hollow bones already splintering under the 1G pressure of the debris. Elias dived into the dust. He didn't have a respirator, but human lungs were designed to filter out the soot of industrial London and the pollen of the Kentish countryside. He coughed once, his immune system already attacking the limestone particles, and kept moving. He reached the Aurelian mother. The beam over her was a massive piece of isection steel. "Easy now," Elias grunted, his voice steady. "I've got you." He didn't use a jack. He didn't have time. He braced his feet against the solid chalk floor, tucked his shoulder under the beam, and drove upward with his legs. This was the moment where Orvin's 4-time standard skeletal density and Senna's standing army of muscles became literal lifesavers. His muscles groaned, the fibers tearing and repairing themselves in real time under the immense strain. His nociceptors sent a wave of heat through his body, but Elias ignored it. With a massive guttural shout, he heaved the beam upward just enough for the mother to scramble out. "Go! Get to the shuttle!" he roared. As she fled, the ground beneath Elias gave way. A massive section of the cliff face sheared off. Elias didn't scream. He simply calculated his trajectory as he fell, his mind as calm as the eye of a storm. He slammed into a lower terrace, his skeletal structural density absorbing an impact that would have liquefied a Dranaki. He rolled, stood up, and wiped the chalk from his eyes. Any other species would be in a permanent state of non-viable agony. "Yeah, well," Elias sighed. "We humans have a high tolerance for non-viable. It's a trait we picked up somewhere between the Black Death and the Blitz." Thesson sat on the edge of a chair. A very Undranaki gesture. "I have been reviewing the Earth history files again. Specifically the history of this place, Dover. I read about the little ships. In one of your ancient wars, thousands of civilians took small fragile boats across that dangerous water to save their soldiers. They didn't have to. They just did." Elias nodded. "Dunkirk. Yeah, that's the spirit of the place, I suppose. I used to think humanity was a mistake," Thessan confessed. "A biological anomaly that shouldn't exist in a civilized galaxy. But today I watched a Deathworlder become a shield. You didn't just survive the environment, Mr. Thorne. You mastered the pain of it to save someone who had called you a hazard." Elias looked out the viewport at the English Channel. The moon was rising, casting a silver light over the restless water. "We're all hazards to someone, Director. The trick is knowing when to be a hazard for someone." Thessan stood up. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a new paper crane, but this one wasn't made of repair manual paper. It was made of high-quality, crystalline reinforced parchment. "I made this," she said, placing it on his bedside table. "It is not perfect. My fingers do not have your persistence. But I wanted to understand the focus." Elias looked at the crystalline crane. It was beautiful, shimmering in the medbay's light. "You did a good job, Director. Best get some rest. I imagine you've got a lot of recalibration requests to file tomorrow." Section character count, 3,562 total character count, 32,475 the next morning. The Dover outpost was bathed in a rare, golden English sunshine. The chalk dust had settled, and the sounds of reconstruction filled the air. Elias Thorne stood on the deck of his ship, the Harrower. His arm was still in a cast, but he was already barking orders to a crew of mixed species. He had hired a few Aurelians who were brave enough to work with a human, and even Pip had signed on as the primary engineer, provided Elias didn't accidentally stomp on him. Captain Clyde stood on the dock, watching them prepare to depart for the Stardebris salvage job. "You're leaving already?" Clyde asked, his iridescent feathers glowing in the sun. Deadlines don't wait for broken bones, Captain, Elias shouted back. Besides, the harrower needs to stretch her legs. She wasn't built to sit in a dock. Thorn, Cleis called out as the engines began to hum. A deep, powerful vibration that caused the dock to tremble. The Academy has issued a new directive. They're calling it the Thorn Protocol. Elias paused, his hand on the throttle. Sounds fancy. What's it mean? It means that from now on, every medical intake for a human will be classified not by what might kill them, but by what they can survive, Cleis explained, his click translator sounding almost proud. And it means that Earth is no longer just a death world. It's being reclassified as a guardian world. Elias felt a strange tightening in his chest, a human emotion that no diagnostic scan could ever quite capture. He looked back at the white cliffs, at the station anchored to the ancient limestone, and at the gray water that had shaped his ancestors. Guardian world, Elias muttered to himself. I like the sound of that. He pushed the throttle forward. The harrower roared to life, its massive engines pushing against the 1G gravity of Earth with ease. The ship surged forward, leaving the Dover outpost behind and heading toward the dark, beautiful mystery of the stars. Back in the medical bay, the scanning ring was empty. The floating holographic metrics had been updated. The stark red typography was gone, replaced by a steady calm blue. The numbers were still there, the density, the immune count, the nociceptor peaks, but they were no longer terrifying. They were recognized. On Director Thesson's desk, the two paper cranes sat side by side. One was made of mundane, crumpled paper, scarred and worn. The other was made of crystalline parchment, fragile and new. They were different in every way, material, origin and design, but they held the same shape. They were both persistent patterns, surviving in a universe that was never meant to be easy. And as the sun set over the English Channel, the cliffs of Dover stood firm, a white wall of limestone against the endless sea. They were old, they were scarred, and they were beautiful, just like the people who called them home. The galaxy was a house, and the humans had indeed built the foundation in a storm. And as long as there were Deathworlders like Elias Thorn, the house would never fall. Section character count. 3,428 total character count. 35,903 in the quiet hours of the night. Dover Station hummed with a different energy. It was the sound of a paradigm shift. The alien crews no longer spoke of humans in hushed, terrified whispers. They spoke of them with a cautious, burgeoning wonder. They watched the humans work, marveling at the way they moved through the world. Not as invaders, but as masters of their own fragility. MedTech UV stood in the observation deck, watching the harrower disappear into the star field. She held her paper crane, her empathic receptors sensing the lingering focus of Elias Thorn. It was a dense, heavy feeling, but it no longer made her eyes roll back. It made her feel grounded. She thought about Senna, the cadet who had started it all by simply sitting in a chair and breaking a system. She thought about the standing army, in the human blood and the haunting persistence of their cells. They are not the anomaly, UV whispered to the stars. We are the ones who were too quiet. In the distance, the Goodwin Nebula swirled. A violet monster that had met its match in a man with a cup of tea and a stubborn heart. The nebula hadn't changed. It was still a place of crushing pressure and lethal radiation. But the way the galaxy looked at it had changed. It was no longer an impassable barrier. It was just a job for a human. And in the heart of London, in the rebuilding zones where the limestone was being laid for new monuments, the spirit of Dover lived on. It was a spirit of resilience, of dark humor, and of an unbreakable will. Elias Thorn, somewhere in the deep black of the Gordian Reach, leaned back in his pilot's chair. His arm throbbed, his ribs ached, and his heart beat a steady calm 68 times per minute. He reached for his mug of Earl Grey, the steam rising in the zero-G cockpit, forming tiny persistent clouds. Right then, he whispered to the empty space in front of him, let's see what else this galaxy thinks is impossible. The harrower surged into warp, a tiny speck of human persistence vanishing into the infinite. The story of the Deathworlders had only just begun, and the galaxy was finally ready to listen to how it unfolded. Section character count, 2,411 total character count. 38,314. The final report in the Aurelius Academy archives was eventually moved from the biological hazards section to the essential galactic sociology wing. It became required reading for every medic, navigator, and diplomat who would ever encounter a human. But for those who lived on Dover Outpost, the truth didn't need to be read in a report. It was seen in the way a human father carried his child through the high-gravity docks. It was felt in the way a human engineer laughed in the face of a failing reactor. And it was understood every time a heavy rhythmic footstep echoed through the iron corridors. The humans were home. And because they were home, the rest of the galaxy finally felt a little bit safer. The cliffs of Dover remained white and ancient, watching the tide go out. They had survived the Romans, the Normans, the Great Expansion, and the first steps into the void. They would survive whatever came next. Because beneath the white chalk was the same thing that lived inside Elias Thorne and Senna. A persistent pattern that survives while its material burns away and rebuilds. The paper cranes on Thesson's desk didn't move. They didn't need to. They had already changed the universe. Se with circumflex u twin sang toa with tilde hanta with graven h. Section character count. 1,324 total character count. 39,638.